Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. We'd like to, on behalf of the University of Illinois Extension, I'd like to welcome you to the Local Government Information and Education Network webinar, which will address the Illinois state budget crisis and the impact on local governments. This program is being provided in cooperation with the Institute of Government and Public Affairs with the University of Illinois. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available for review on our local government website. To ensure the best possible quality in our recording, microphones will be muted during the presentation. We do, however, encourage you to add questions in the chat space as we move through the presentation. We will help the presenter with a question and answer section at the end of the program. This program was made possible through funding through the University of Illinois Extension and demonstrates the core mission of the University of Illinois to bring research from the land-grant college to the citizens of Illinois. Like I said, our program today is being provided in cooperation with the Institute of Government and Public Affairs with the University of Illinois and with the funding made available through the University of Illinois Extension. Today's speaker is Professor Fred Goertz, who serves in the Department of Economics with the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and with the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the university. Professor Goertz frequently writes about the Illinois budget and general economic issues in publications such as the State Tax Notes, the Central Illinois Business Magazine, as well as compiles the U of I Flash Index, which is a monthly indicator of the Illinois economy. So with that, we'll hand the floor over to Professor Goertz, and we'll let him take over the presentation.
The delay, I'll repeat myself even though no one heard me. This is a very challenging time in the state of Illinois. Every budget year is a challenge. This is unusually challenging because we're talking about a new budget when we don't even have an old budget. That's particularly a concern for people who are involved in government, clearly at the state level, if you're a member of a university or a community college, but it's also has a lot of implications for other local government officials. In particular, there's the likelihood there may be various kinds of cutbacks in terms of programs that are important at the local level, and maybe aid in various forms that may not be forthcoming. And there's an additional level laid on top of this, and that is that the governor also is proposing some kind of property tax limitation or freeze. So we could very well be in a situation where the state aid is cut back, and the usual response to that is finding some local source of revenue, and it may be a situation where the local source of revenue actually is precluded because of some type of freeze. So that's where we stand. So it's a very interesting and more than interesting, troubling kind of environment. So my slide presentation is as background, so I'm not going to go through here in great detail until we get to the Illinois budget issue. But the overview is that we're in a national economy that's had a very, very slow recovery from the recession of 2007 to 2009. People find it hard to believe we've been in recovery now for 6 years almost, and recovery hasn't been nearly as buoyant as we would like. So there are lots of national issues, and then added to that, the first item here is recovery picking up, and that was true until a month or two ago, and now there's some uncertainty beginning in 2016 about how strong the recovery is going to continue. So we've had a slow recovery, and now we have maybe even slower recovery that we're still waiting to find out the direction. On top of that, obviously, Illinois is very dependent on the national economy, but Illinois has had most of the things happen that have happened at the national level, including the slow performance. But in addition to that, we've been even slower relative to the rest of the country. So we have that problem, and we have problems that we're talking about of both the short-term and long-term fiscal imbalance at the state level. So that's the challenge facing the governor and the General Assembly. Now, the next slides that just basically reiterate what I was saying. The first one, here, number 4, shows that the current recovery is much slower than the average recovery. So even though we had a big downturn, we haven't bounced back very fast. This also shows that finally, after several years, our gross domestic product here is higher than it was at the beginning of the recession. So we're actually back in new ground again, but it's taken a long time to get there. The next one is Illinois per capita income. And what we find here is something that may be a little bit surprising. Illinois has slow growth and a lot of problems. We're still a relatively prosperous state compared to the rest of the country. Our per capita income is about 5% more than the national average. The problem, though, is that we used to be even more superior to the rest of the country. So there's been a erosion of the margin of superiority. We're still a rich and prosperous state compared to most other places. And the same thing here in the next slide shows household income in Illinois versus the country. We used to be a whole lot above the national average. Now we're only slightly above. And I won't go through the next in great detail, but our unemployment rate also is higher than the national average. And until a year ago or so, we were catching up. But in the last few months, it's kind of gone the other direction, that there's been a increase in the differential between the state and the U.S. But the good news is we're way, way down. If you see the upper diagram here in this slide with 2 graphs, we were up around about 10%. Now we're down around 6%. So even though we're still lagging the rest of the country, we're a lot better off than we were in recent years. And the same point here is that our employment in Illinois has recovered fairly slowly. We're still not back to where we were before the recession. And then finally, something that I'm involved with is called the Illinois Flash Index. And what you find here is a lot of information, but the fact is that regardless of what you hear, Illinois is still growing. The problem, though, is it's growing at a relatively slow rate. So that's the kind of backdrop for the fiscal situation. So the fiscal situation is unlike anything I've seen, as I mentioned earlier. Typically, when you have a budget address like yesterday's address by Governor Bronner, the question is how do we proceed into next year based on where we are this year? But this year, as you probably well know, we don't have a state budget. So we're in a situation where we're trying to plan for a budget for fiscal 2017, which begins in July of this year. And we don't have even have a budget for fiscal 16, which began 8 or 9 months ago, 8 months ago, in July 1st of 2015. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about a new budget when you don't have an old budget. So that's the kind of problem we're facing right now. And the next slide, which is something which is more important in terms of what we're going to be talking about, is one that has 2 graphs. One on the left is in blue and one on the right is in red. And this is a study done by the Institute of Government and Public Affairs about the state fiscal situation. And what this suggests is that we have a 2 or a 3-fold problem. The first problem we mentioned is that we don't have a budget. The second problem in the short term is that the way we're spending and the way we have been spending in the past few years is a situation where we're actually not paying for everything that we're doing, that we have a deficit. And then in addition to this, this is what the 2 graphs portray, is that this deficit that exists now is likely to grow in the future. This is something called a structural deficit. You look at the taxes that are on the books and look at the promises we made in terms of expenditure programs. The unfortunate result there is that spending grows faster than revenues, and the deficit we have now is going to become even larger. So that's the kind of basic bad news, and then there are 2 additional pieces of negative news on top of that. The first, if you look at the left-hand one with the 2 blue lines, the top line was what would happen if the pension reform bill that was approved a couple of years ago actually went into operation. And as most of you well know, it was ruled unconstitutional by the Illinois Supreme Court. So the expected savings there will not be realized, so the deficit is going to be even larger than it was forecast. The second figure is the same kind of idea, but a different cause, and that is that starting a little bit over a year ago in January 2015, the temporary tax increase that went from 3% to 5% ratcheted down to 3.75%, and that extra revenue is not coming in, and so we're getting less revenue than we would have under the existing higher tax rate. So two things have happened that made the bad situation even worse, and one is that we've lost the revenue from the tax increase. The second is that we haven't saved anything from the so-called pension reform. So the state's obviously in a very serious kind of problem. Now, this is not a separate problem, a sort of manifestation of that. The next slide isn't quite up to date, but I can add the extra information. And that is, the state has financed this deficit in a variety of ways, maybe borrowing money and sometimes raiding other funds. They've taken money out of the road fund to put it into other funds, things of that sort. But in addition to that, they simply haven't paid their bills on time. And this is 2013, but if you go forward to today, it's back again to almost 2011 level, about $7 billion or $8 billion of unpaid bills. So in addition to the fact we're not raising enough money to pay for our expenses and activities right now, we also have this overhang of past bills that still need to be paid. So the next slide is kind of a summary of where we are, and I'll go down there in a more careful way than I have so far, and that's the challenges to Illinois. So again, we have an immediate problem right now, which we're all aware of. We don't have a budget for this year. So in the past, the state had always been able to come up with a budget, even though it's not a very enlightened one. It doesn't deal with our long-term problems. We've always had a budget, and that's come to be known as kicking the can down the road. So typically, we don't solve our problems. We find a way to patch things together to get through one extra year. But in 2016, we have to kick the can down the road. So the first problem is, how do we get through this year with the smaller amount of tax revenue than was coming in earlier, without the pension reform and without a budget? And what's happened so far has just been a kind of hodgepodge of some kind of changes that haven't been part of a major budget, but simply a bunch of expedients. The state has, in fact, funded elementary and secondary education. They haven't funded higher education, so community colleges and universities basically have no state aid so far this year. And not only that, the community colleges and the universities have had an extra drain on their funds because they've been paying the assistance program, it's called the MAP program for college students, which usually comes from the state. So the state's has not given the universities any money, the community colleges any money this year. In addition to that, they've had to pay expenses that typically were paid by the state. So some organizations are doing fairly well, elementary and secondary. A lot of service providers, colleges, and so on are not doing as well. So that problem has to be dealt with in view of the larger problem. So the first thing is to sort of try to patch together something for 2016, 7 or 8 months into the fiscal year. Then the attention then turns to the budget for next year, the one that Governor Rauner talked about yesterday. And here's the kind of impasse that we face. Typically, again, it's just a matter of can we get together with a budget. And there's one layer of complexity added to this now. The governor says, I won't deal with any budget issues, including the possibility of a tax increase, until the General Assembly approves some or all of my so-called turnaround agenda. And that adds an additional level of complexity. So if you go to the next page, you see the turnaround agenda, which is kind of holding the budget hostage. I guess that's the terms the Democrats use, or Governor Ronald would probably say the turnaround agenda is being held hostage by the budget. But anyway, this is a very ambitious agenda. A property tax freeze, some change in the prevailing wage rules about hiring construction workers and so on by local governments. A really major one that legislators are not fond of would be to change the way we redistrict the state for the General Assembly. The government wants to save on workers' comp costs. He would like to have term limits. He'd like to have some provision, or at least some discussion of the possibility of municipal bankruptcy, limiting the awards and lawsuits, especially medical care ones. And a really big one in terms of labor is some kind of move towards right-to-work laws. That is, not requiring people to the union to maintain employment. So those are really substantial things. And the problem the governor faces is that he's a Republican, but he's not. His success in running for office did not carry over to the General Assembly. The General Assembly reached its Democratic majority, and it has a substantial majority in both the House and the Senate. So you have the House and the Senate who are very much opposed to many of these so-called turnaround agenda items, and you have the governor saying, I want to act on the budget until something is done there. So that's where we've been for, I guess, now starting in July 1st. And my opinion, if you'd asked me 7 or 8 months ago, would be, well, this will go on for weeks or maybe a month or two, but maybe eventually something's going to happen. But so far it hasn't happened, and there seems to be a lot of uncertainty here about whether we'll actually do something about this or not. And the question no one knows about is what the governor's. Okay, anyway, the turnaround agenda is a very ambitious one. There's no way that all these things are going to be passed, and especially things that have a big impact on labor. So the question is, what's the governor willing to give in on, and what's the General Assembly willing to approve? And right now, we don't really know the answer to that. No one's giving away their bargaining. Okay, so that's sort of the situation we face. And even that, though, you just say, well, that would be a big deal to solve that. But all that would do is getting us back to the kick the can down the road scenario where we just sort of limp along and have one more budget, but don't deal with their underlying long-term issues. And then the governor asserts, and again, I don't have a strong opinion about all the turnaround agenda, but he asserts that if we approve the turnaround agenda, Illinois would suddenly start growing much more rapidly, and that would bring in lots and lots of extra tax revenue. That would go a long ways to solving our problem. Well, again, I think some of the turnaround agenda items are very good. They would improve our business climate, but I think it's quite unlikely it's going to have a dramatic change in terms of suddenly generating huge amounts of extra revenue for the state. It's going to take a long time to the extent that it really is effective. So even if the turnaround agenda is passed, our budget problems are not going to go away. So the long-term issue is a simple one in terms of arithmetic, but a very difficult one in terms of how we actually deal with it politically. If you have a long-term structural deficit, that is your spending, including pension obligations and all those things, exceed your revenues, and they tend to be diverging, there are only two ways to deal with that. One is to figure out a way to get more revenue, and the other is to figure out a way to reduce the rate of growth of spending. And I think that any kind of general sort of solution to this problem, the solution may not be the right name, but any kind of attempt to get this under control is going to involve both of those things. It's going to involve some degree of spending discipline. We're not going to be able to increase spending as much as we would like. We may need to figure out some way to, and again, we can't do this very easily, but figure out a way to rein in future pension costs. And I think the thing that almost everyone realizes, like it or not, is we have to have more tax money. And one of the proposals, which was recently put forward by the Civic Federation of Chicago, actually was a very ambitious one, especially for a relatively conservative organization, talking about raising the income tax rate, extending the taxation of sales to services, and also going back even to taxing food, which we have for many years in Illinois. So none of those things is very attractive to member of the General Assembly, raising taxes or cutting spending. But in the long run, it really has to be addressed. So I guess the worst case scenario would be nothing happens, and people actually are talking about that now. Maybe there won't be a resolution to the 2016 and the 2017 budget until after the election next fall in November. A less pessimistic, but still not very good outcome is that maybe the governor and the General Assembly can come together to agree on a budget, even though it may not be a perfect budget, or at least get back to a more normal situation. And I guess the most hopeful outcome would be that they actually address some of these longer-term kind of problems. And again, these obviously are not easily, for the last one, it's not easily accomplished. We've been dealing with this for years and years and years. Now, going back to what I began with was that this creates a very difficult environment for everyone. If you're a college or community college president planning for the future, it's obviously very difficult. But for most local government people, it also is a difficult kind of situation because, again, some groups actually are losing money. Others aren't getting what they expected. Some social service agencies that may provide services to help a city or county or whatever may be cut back, and that may throw more burden onto the other organizations. So that's a situation where you don't really know where you're going. For example, I'm involved as a foundation member of the local community college, Parkland College, and I heard the president talk about the budget for next year, and there's one possibility we get no money from the state. The other possibility is we get the amount of money we expected, which would be like a 20 to 35% cut from previous years. And in that situation, it's almost impossible to budget, because if you budget for no increase, you may get a fairly substantial amount of extra money from the state. If you expect what the state's promised and budget for that promise may not be fulfilled. You may end up with very little. So it's very difficult to plan in that kind of environment. You have to make some really major changes, like possibly reduce the size of the staff and things of that sort. Then in addition to that, as I talked about at the very beginning, part of the turnaround agenda is, in fact, to freeze property taxes. And if you had a combination of those things, revenue sharing is cut back, and services that are not provided at the same time, you allow local governments to raise more money through property taxation, you're going to have a very difficult kind of situation. So it's really a very, very challenging time, and it's a situation where if you're planning at a school district level or a county or a city level, you really don't know which way to go, because you don't know what the outcome is going to be in the next 6 months or a year. And this is quite different from in the past. As I mentioned earlier, I've been in Illinois for 35, 36 years. And up until relatively recently, we talked about, well, maybe the state could provide more revenue for local governments, particularly school districts. In return, school districts might reduce their property taxes. But now what we're facing is a situation where the state may actually give less money to local governments and at the same time ask them to reduce or at least not increase their property taxes. So this is the kind of world we live in now, and I can't provide any kind of predictions, because it really is a very fluid situation where you have very powerful people at the state level who haven't agreed so far and showed their willingness to hold out for a long time until they get to an agreement they view as favorable. So I guess the best we can hope for is what I call watchful waiting now. We'll watch and wait and then react once we actually know what the situation is. So I'll conclude my discussion at that point. Be happy to answer any questions you have about the details or about other issues that might come up. Okay. So I've stopped presenting.
Get to the question and answer section, and we have several messages that are coming in. One of the questions that we have is, are there any other long-term impacts that you see for local governments?
I don't see any directly aside from the overall, obviously the overall health of the state is going to impact local governments. So if the state can speed up its rate of growth and things, that's where the local governments will benefit. And on the opposite side, if we continue this path and things don't go well, it's going to have the opposite effect. The state faces a serious problem now in terms of attracting new business or keeping existing businesses. Because usually if you move into a state, someone has a business wants to relocate, they say, well, what's the tax situation, what's the infrastructure and so on, and they weigh those. It's not usually the deciding factor, but it has some impact on people's decision. But now if you come into Illinois, you face the problem of buying into this problem, not just the problem that's going to happen in the future, but paying for the problem that's happened in past years. So that's an extra burden, and it makes it more difficult for the state to turn around and get to where we'd like to be. And unfortunately, even though, again, some of the turnaround agenda is probably a very positive way to go for the state, it's not going to take away the obligations we have to deal with our overhang of past problems.
Okay, we have one question that says the LaSalle Street tax is being considered for some to fix for Illinois' budget hole. Are there any thoughts on the impacts that would have on the state and the region?
Yeah, I actually gave a presentation recently to the Urbana City Council about this, so I may go a little bit longer than normal for an answer to the question. But the so-called LaSalle Street tax is really a financial transactions tax, and this has been a proposal for many years. Actually, one of the first people that proposed it was an economist named James Tobin, who's a Nobel Prize winner, but he happened to grow up in Champaign. And his argument was that part of the reason we have so much instability, he was talking more about foreign currency markets, was because of a lot of trading, a lot of speculation, and a tax might make it more costly to do that and might reduce the amount of volatility. So his goal was to impose that for providing more stability, and a byproduct of that is that it would raise some money, and typically now the interest is more on the money side than just the stabilization side. Now the problem with that is that regardless of whether you like it or don't like it, it's very unlikely to work in a less than national or even international environment. Because one of the problems you face with trying to raise taxes is that the base that you use for taxation can be very mobile. You know, if you tax people, they can move from one place to another, and so on. But that kind of movement is pretty hard and involves a lot of cost. But think about moving financial transactions. How much would it cost to move transactions from Chicago to Indiana, or in the past, what New York has found is how much would it cost to move transactions from New York to New Jersey? And the answer is not very much. So I've seen some really wild estimates, like the state could raise $10 or $11 billion for a financial transactions tax. That's based upon the number of transactions that we have today. But my expectation, I think almost everyone's expectation, is if you did that just in Chicago or just in the state of Illinois, you collect very, very little because most of the transactions will migrate someplace else. So again, regardless of the overall merits of a financial transactions tax, it's not likely to be a solution to Illinois' problems.
Okay, we have another question. With such uncertainty, how can we battle against population and businesses exiting Illinois?
Well, I think the answer is to, which is easy, again, as an observer, it's really easy to answer these questions. As a politician, it's not. There are two things that the state can do to try to deal with this kind of issue. And one thing is that it's not probably very likely to work is to go out and try to attract businesses on an individual basis and give them some kind of special deal to come here. Typically, there are like 6 or 7 million people working in Illinois. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people lose their jobs, and hundreds of thousands of other people gain jobs. So the real final bottom line is the combination of how much do we gain versus how much do we lose. So attracting a factory here of 50 people or a factory there of 300 people is really great, but it does bring a little for this overall net impact in terms of job growth. So what an economist would say is that what we need is a stable tax environment, not necessarily a really low tax environment, but a stable, predictable tax environment that's able to provide the kinds of services that businesses and people want, in particular kinds of infrastructure. Most basic is highways and transportation, maintaining O'Hare, which is obviously probably the most important economic factor in the whole state, having a world-class airport, doing things like that, dealing with ways of being able to move freight through the Chicago area faster, things of that sort, and obviously a little bit self-serving, maintaining a good system of higher education and, I'll mention, the secondary education. So businesses aren't necessarily interested in the lowest tax possible. They're interested in a stable, reasonable tax environment that provides the kind of services I talked about. So I think that's the direction we have to go. But again, that's not going to transform the state instantaneously. It's going to take time to do that.
Okay, we have one more. We have a couple more questions. How long can we go? How long can the budget impasse go on? And does our Constitution address this?
I think the answer is my answer is I don't know, because it's already gone longer than I thought it could go. So politicians are very creative, ingenious people. Back in 2003, when Dr. Blagojevich came into office, he started his program. I'm not talking about the illegality, but simply the kind of expediency he was carrying out, where he would spend money, figure out ways to finance by borrowing money, selling assets, or underfunding pension. I said, well, he can get away with that for a year or two, but he can't do it very long. Well, actually, he got away with it until he was impeached and removed from office. So bad things can happen for a longer period of time than I think. So again, my prediction is that they'll probably solve something by the end of this fiscal year in the next 2 or 3 months. But I've been wrong before, and could very well be wrong this time.
Okay, we have another question on that same line. Does the legislature have any items on their own agenda that that the governor said that he would veto that they might compromise on?
Well, they do, but they're not right now on paper. The General Assembly and the Democratic majority can do anything they want. They have not just a majority, but they have a majority large enough to override the governor's veto. But they don't have complete discipline among their members, so they can pass things, and if the governor vetoes them, they probably don't have the discipline to get everyone to uphold that. So they have some limitations there. But obviously, both, I'm not sure, when we talk about the General Assembly, there are hundreds of members, but we're usually talking about Speaker Madigan in the House versus Governor Rauner, and both of them said they're willing to compromise. But what what each one thinks is a generous compromise, the other side thinks is not going far enough. So basically, that's where we stand right now. That there's a lot of personal animosity. I read a story today that when the speaker greeted the governor yesterday for the budget address, he said, "Thanks for running a candidate in my district," but he's not very happy about the fact that a Democratic challenger in the primary is being funded by, very likely by Republicans to go up against him. So it's not a happy environment over there.
Okay, we have a couple of more questions. You mentioned the possibility of a service tax in Illinois. Do we have any recent examples of such a tax being implemented in a state at the state level and the impact that it's on that state's economy?
Well, and the answer is there are lots of states do that to a greater extent than Illinois, and it makes absolutely. I'll talk as an economist now, not as a politician. It makes complete sense to tax services. A sales tax is supposed to be a tax on consumption activities, and it doesn't make a lot of sense if I go out and buy an exercise machine and pay tax on that. If I go to exercise salon or facility and then pay a monthly admission to that, I don't pay tax on that. If I buy a washing machine and detergents and so on to wash my clothes, I pay tax on that. I don't pay tax if I take it to a dry cleaner. So in theory, it makes very little sense to tax one kind of consumption and not tax another. And it's particularly problematic because the service sector is growing faster than the goods sector, so we're not keeping up in terms of revenue. So doing that would be very, very reasonable. Now, there's a misunderstanding that a lot of people have and say, well, if we start taxing services, we tax lawyers and advertising firms and people like that. Well, the argument is not to tax all services, but to tax consumer services, because the sales tax base is supposed to be kind of measure of consumption. So if you don't want to tax business services provided to other businesses, which whose services will eventually be taxed. So it's not taxing all services, but basically taxing consumer services. That's not going to be a solution to all our problems, but it'd be one step in the direction of making our revenue system more expansive and have a broader base.
Okay, we have one last question, and it's regarding, are there any estimates on the value of investing in locally grown businesses rather than trying to attract larger corporations that might employ many more? But it doesn't seem to be a stable, or does it seem to be stable in our communities? The individual is worried that they're no longer helping small businesses develop the state economy or as a development strategy.
Right. Well, let me give a kind of economist answer, and then try to make it a little bit more accessible. The fact is that unlike what you hear, is that governments don't really have a whole lot to do about business success. If that were the case, President Obama would be doing all kinds of things to make the economy grow faster, and Governor Rauner and Governor Quinn would have done all these things. So there's no easy thing to do for the state to improve businesses or attract businesses. In particular, it's very counterproductive to try to attract a firm or encourage a firm that doesn't really have what economists call a comparative advantage in Illinois. Government subsidies and tax breaks and things of that sort usually can't overcome whatever natural obstacles there are, and to the extent they do, it makes the business very tenuous. So the real challenge is not to grow bananas in Illinois, but to figure out something that we really have an advantage at doing, and finding that there's some sort of impediment or some kind of regulatory hurdle or something of that sort that's preventing it from manifesting itself, and then get rid of those things. But you really can't turn the tide here and get a business to come into Illinois that's really not just well suited for Illinois just by giving it a few tax advantages. So it is a very challenging kind of thing, and it goes against the politicians' way of operating. They would much rather cut a ribbon or be able to go to a plant and shake hands with the new employees than figure out some way to have a general kind of improvement of the economy, which wouldn't manifest itself in any one particular opening or closing.
Okay. We will. Oh, I guess did that conclude your answer? I guess I should ask.
No, I include my answer, but I'm happy
Okay.
to either stop or answer more questions, whichever you want to go.
Okay. We'll kind of give a little bit more time if there are any additional follow-up questions.
No, I'm sorry for the communications difficulty. I know that's troubling if you're trying to listen. Things aren't going as well as you hope.
We actually have a couple more questions that are coming in. Is there any word on a local government distributive fund, an LGDB or DF fund?
Well, I think the question would be that if they decide to have a permanent tax increase, the real question would be, would they share that with local governments? So in the past, a fixed percentage of income tax revenue has been distributed back to municipalities and incorporated county areas based on a percentage. And sometimes when there's a tax increase, the same percentage holds and they give more money back to the local governments. And in other cases, they don't do that. So I think that's an open question. When there's going to be a tax increase, the question was, what's going to happen to that extra revenue? Will it all go to the state, or part of it go back to local governments? And that could go either way. It'll be probably a source of some intense lobbying.
Okay. We have one additional question. Are they going to take anything from the local governments?
Well, I don't think they'll take it in the sense that they'll come in and say, you have to give us something that you already have. But I suspect that there's going to be some decrease in generosity. For example, I wouldn't expect that spending for schools is going to increase year after year. The governor said he wants to increase it, but I suspect that some of the aid will not be. It's not that they'll necessarily take it away, but it's not going to grow as fast as it might in other circumstances.
Okay. With the one act.
Okay, one more issue that we haven't talked about very much, and that's the area of roads. I think that Illinois needs to deal not just with the short run situation, they also need to deal with infrastructure, and we probably have a lot of potential there, possibly for even increasing the gasoline tax to provide some funds for infrastructure, particularly roads and mass transit.
Okay. We have, with that, well, we actually have one more question that we can try to squeeze in. Have you seen the proposed new formula for education? Your thoughts on the existing and new formula?
Well, I've seen it from afar. I think this is not the time for a new form of education. The case can be made that we don't distribute state funds in an appropriate way, and particularly we don't give out to the school districts that have low capacity. And the argument there is compelling, but it's, again, in my opinion, very unlikely in the kind of environment we're in now to have that happen. And the reason for that is that typically when you change the skill aid formula, there are winners and losers. And one way to get a political agreement is to compensate some of the losers. So you give more money. A lot of that money goes to poor districts, and some of the money goes to buffer the loss that's being experienced by higher capacity districts. And we simply don't have that capability right now of having money to buffer the sort of feelings that people have when you do these kind of changes. Because a new aid formula means there are winners and losers, and the losers have quite a bit of political power. So I don't think, my view is it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Okay. Well, Arn, I think with that last question, On behalf of the University of Illinois Extension Local Government and Information Network, Education Network, I'd like to thank Professor Gertz for his presentation today. It was a really good topic and timely discussion with the governor's budget address yesterday. If you do have any questions, we do have an email that has been posted within the conversation area. If you would, you can send any of your questions to that email address as well. And then in addition to that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending again today. With that, I will go ahead and end today's presentation, and thank you all for attending.